Our next literary term that we're going to be covering as we're going through this unit of the textbook is the topic of theme. And we're going to use the story Two Legs or One, our next story in this unit, to cover this topic. We start with the overarching question of what is theme? Well, let's look at a couple examples. I have here for you 4 examples of superheroes. I've got Captain America, created from a serum created by scientists. We've got Wonder Woman of the Amazons. We've got Tony Stark as Iron Man, wealthy billionaire philanthropist Tony Stark. And then we've got Captain Marvel at the end, becoming a superhero from coming into contact with an alien substance. 4 very different characters. But what does each story have in common? Well, in the end, no matter where they come from or how they came to be heroes, they are all heroes. And their stories all have a similar message about life. And that story, that message, is that good triumphs over evil. That message that all 4 of these stories contain, though different characters from different time periods, even from different comic book publishers, all have a message, and that's called a theme. You can sum up a story's theme in one statement, usually a sentence length statement that describes a broad lesson about life. And that is one way that we are going to define theme, is those 3 final words there, a lesson about life. So in today's video, you're going to get a chance to understand what theme is. You're going to get a chance to understand what the difference is between theme concepts and theme statements. We're going to go over a couple examples and allow you to identify these universal themes that occur throughout different stories and different genres. We're going to compare universal themes and do they really fit across different things that we read, different texts that we read? And then can we identify some support? Can we have some evidence that backs up these universal themes that occur across different texts that we read? And we're going to understand the difference between universal themes and recurring themes. Got a lot to cover. Let's get started with the first one. The difference between a theme concept and a theme statement. A theme concept is a bigger topic that a story usually touches on. A theme concept can usually be described in a single word. And there's some common ones that we encounter. I'll give you a few examples. They are not the only ones, but they are the most common that you're going to see. For example, if a story is about love, that is a theme concept. If a story is about forgiveness, theme concept. Stories about pain of some kind. These are these are theme concepts. They can be described in one word. Now, a theme statement is what that thing we're reading says about that topic. Usually a theme statement is described in a sentence length version or form. Going back to our theme concepts, let's borrow one here. If we said, what is this story about that we've read? And somebody was to say, the story is about love. Well, then we have to ask ourselves, what are we learning about love from this story? The response would be in a sentence form, and might take on the idea of love is blind. And that is the lesson that we learn from the story Love is Blind. Or maybe another example, you can't buy love. To further drive this point home, let's take a look at a short video that is going to challenge us to consider what the theme concept is behind it. One word to describe what the theme is, and then a theme statement, taking that word and maybe putting it into a sentence form. So let's watch this video called Joy versus Heron. So when we consider the story Joy and Heron, think about what theme concepts come to mind when you consider what happened in the story between the dog, Joy, and the heron, the bird who came and visited the fishing boat. Theme concepts. What are a couple of words that you'd say that story was about blank? Then, beyond that, we would want to take those words and give each of them a sentence. So, take your theme concepts you have and write them into a sentence. Write some sentences that include those words. Those would be the theme statements, what we learn about that theme concept through this particular video. Now, there are some themes that we would call universal. And many writers express similar messages about ideas and issues that matter. And they could be poets, they could be short story writers, they could be novel writers, they could be movie and television directors who want to share a message that happens to be the same that you'd find in those other genres that I mentioned. Looking again at love and war and friendship, greed. These are all themes that have been discussed in writing from the beginning of time. Writing and even spoken stories that come from time periods long ago that didn't have a written language. These stories would be told verbally and would have these universal themes: love, war, friendship, greed. These are big examples of universal themes. You're going to find them in stories from around the world, from time periods throughout history. Doesn't matter, you're going to find them everywhere and anywhere you do reading. That makes them universal. So when we say universal themes, that means that we would define them as they appear again and again in literature, what we read, art, what we look at, poetry, songs, and other types of media from different time periods throughout history and around the world. Universal themes are universal because they explore these feelings and these experiences that people have, that you could say are shared experiences throughout time and throughout the world, because they affect all of us. Love affects all of us. Greed affects all of us. War affects all of us. And these universal themes appear across different genres: fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and even drama, like plays that we read and watch. Let's look at a couple images and see some examples of universal themes. As you see them, ask yourself, in what books and what folk tales and what movies and what TV shows have I encountered or come across themes like these? The idea that good deeds are eventually rewarded. If a person works hard enough and is honest enough and does not cut corners or cheat or lie or steal, but they do the right thing, those good deeds are eventually going to be rewarded. Another one: pride comes before the fall. You see it in TV shows and movies and stories and books that you read. If someone gets too proud, too boastful, too overconfident, or full of themselves, usually that is followed by them falling from grace in some way and not staying at that level that they've maintained maybe from the beginning of the story throughout. That's one that you're going to see in all different types of stories from around the world and throughout time. A couple others: greed can destroy people, or money cannot buy happiness. Again, universal. You can see it in different genres: poetry, plays, fiction, nonfiction. And these things can appear from stories around the world. You can find them in folk tales that are told by word of mouth in Africa, to movies and TV shows here in America that deal with these same things. These are the kind of things that make a theme, a message of a story, universal. So these universal themes are those very familiar, very common messages that appear in literature, in our case, since we're in language arts class, literature from many different cultures and many different time periods. As we look at some examples, we ask ourselves, what universal theme does this particular passage express? The example says, in the end, It had not mattered that the enemy's army was larger or that its leaders and soldiers were unspeakably cruel. The evil regime had been confronted by an army of people who believed in justice and peace, and that army could never be stopped. So, that is one example, one passage or summary of a story you might read, a movie you might see. And when we see that, we ask ourselves, what universal theme does this passage express? Is it war's horrible? Is it good will triumph over evil? Or is it life without love isn't worth living? This story sounds like it describes the idea that good is going to triumph over evil. It's universal because you're not going to just hear this in a story about war or battles, but you're going to see that good will triumph over evil in fairy tales, in Disney movies, in nonfiction books you read, in fiction books you read. This is what makes themes like this universal. It's going to appear in many different places. We're going to look at two universal themes and how it will appear across different types of texts. Below the picture, you're going to see a short poem, and you're going to see a passage from could be a fiction or a nonfiction story, but definitely not poetry. On the left, we see an example of a poem. The sticks, one by one, are easily broken, but when tied together, they are as strong as a shield. And on the right, we've got something from a non poetry piece. We'd call it prose. And it says, for years, they had watched as factory owners fired anyone who spoke up about the low pay and the long hours. Now they were all standing together, and the owners could no longer ignore them. So we see two very different pieces here. On the left, we see a poem about sticks, and on the right, we see a story, nonfiction or fiction, about factory workers. So we look at the topic. What's the topic of this poem? Well, it seems to be about sticks. What's the theme of the poem? When you put things together, they are more difficult to break. Togetherness matters. Togetherness accomplishes goals. And on the right, what's the topic of the story? Well, it's about factory workers. What's the theme of the story? Well, those who stick together are stronger. So you can see universal themes across genres. Here on the left about poetry, here on the right about prose, about a fiction or nonfiction story. And no matter poetry or prose, that universal theme can occur in both. So let's look at a couple ideas in these texts below, and do they have similar messages? On the left, we've got a story, a summary of a story that kind of goes with the picture you see. The pirate Greybeard promised his trembling prisoners he would set them free at the next island. But as they passed island after island, the prisoners despaired. And on the right, we've got a folk tale, a story about animals who talk. The fox and the donkey made a pact or an agreement with each other. One day, they met a lion. Fox secretly went up to the lion and said, if I deliver the donkey to you, will you promise not to harm me? The lion agreed. Fox led the donkey to a ditch and pushed him in. There's your donkey, said Fox to the lion. The lion ate the fox for lunch and later ate the donkey for dinner. So you've got a story about a pirate on the left, you've got a folk tale about talking animals on the right. Can these two very different stories even remotely or possibly have a universal theme despite the fact they are very different stories from very different genres? The answer is yes, they can. Both of these stories on the left and the right of the picture both have plots or series of events in the story that deal with lying and breaking promises. So these two passages communicate a universal theme. Which of them expresses the universal theme? So, what's our theme based on those two stories that you just saw about the pirates on the left and the talking animals on the right? Everyone has good in them, history repeats itself, enemies and lions cannot be trusted, and lions and pirates have a lot in common. Everyone has good in them, history repeats itself, enemies cannot be trusted, lions and pirates have a lot in common. What is the universal theme that both of those share? No matter which story you're talking about, pirates or talking animals, both of them had an enemy in them that could not be trusted and was demonstrated by the events that were described in the summary of each story. Once we decide the story has a universal theme, we probably need to support it with some evidence from the story that says that our belief about what the theme or message is of the story has to be true. So a theme has to be supported by details in the story. You can't say a story has a certain theme or has a certain message and then not be able to back it up with some sort of evidence or details from the text. Details such as what the character says, how they behave, and how they change help support our belief about the statement of theme is. Let's look at these two stories we just used, and we're going to select a type of detail that supports our theme that enemies cannot be trusted. Here is the text from each of those two stories we suggested and gave examples from. Let's look at what the characters say that show and support the idea that enemies cannot be trusted. In the first one, the pirate Greybeard verbally promised his trembling prisoners he would set them free at the next island. He said those words. Turned out, we couldn't believe him. In the second story, the lion says to the fox, "Hey, if you deliver the donkey, I promise I won't harm you." Okay, so we got characters saying words that proves that they cannot be trusted. But there's also the idea of what the characters do. The actions of a character can also support, in this case, the theme that enemies cannot be trusted. The pirate shows he can't be trusted because after he passes island versus island, he is not letting these people go and they become despaired. So his actions are showing the theme is true. And in the second story, the fox led the donkey to a ditch and pushed him in, but the lion ate the fox, who he promised he wouldn't eat. He ate him first, and then the donkey second. Both of those have pieces of evidence that show what characters say and what characters do support the theme. In this case, that enemies cannot be trusted. So we're going to use what we've talked about here as we read this passage, and which expresses the theme of loyalty is important even when it's difficult. Universal, remember, is a theme that could appear in lots of different stories and types of stories from around the country, around the world, and even throughout history. Here's a little example. The prisoners of war looked out through the barbed wire. The captain screamed, "I order you to tell me which prisoner stole the food. If you do not turn him in, you will all pay for his mistake." The prisoners looked at each other. They knew who it was, but said nothing. Silently, they waited for their punishment. So, which detail in that text supports the theme that loyalty is important even when it's difficult? Is it the fact that there's barbed wire? Is it the fact that the prisoners remain silent? Or is it the characters are at war? Which of those things do you feel supports the message or the theme that loyalty is important even when it's difficult? The answer here is that the prisoners remain silent. They are loyal to the person who has made the mistake, even though they realize they're going to get in trouble and be punished for it, which makes it difficult. So that evidence supports that theme from this story. Now, sometimes in stories, in movies and TV shows, a particular event or a time period of that time will produce a lot of works in art, visual, performing, musical arts, and literature that share this related theme. When you see the same message being told through song, through poetry, through plays, through fiction, through nonfiction, that's called a recurring theme. It happens all the time in a particular time period. For example, the Great Depression, a time period in American history where millions of people were poor and living in poverty because of a series of events. We see here it described that the Great Depression had economic insecurity. People were scared about money. And combine that with the collapse of farming communities, there wasn't enough success in farming. If you lived in this time period of the Great Depression, you're going to write about what you know. And a lot of these writers grew up in a time period where their families and they did not have a lot of money and struggled financially to survive. So if you're living in a time period like that where you don't have a lot of money, you don't know where your next meal is coming from, you're always scared about your finances, or if your house is going to get taken away, or where your next meal is going to come from, that's what you're going to write about. You're going to write about what you know. And these people would write about resilience, being tough in hard times. They'd write about poverty, being poor. They'd write about having to work hard, even as kids, to help support their family. This is a recurring theme of the people of this time period because that is what they knew. So we see here that the themes that people wrote about in this time period, the struggles of ordinary people are important. It's important to know their stories. And another one could be the powerless must work together against the powerful. Those who didn't have a lot had to work together to fight for equality from those who did have a lot. Here's another one from the Industrial Revolution, a time period where factories began popping up everywhere and machinery and took place and started in manufacturing goods in a larger, quicker way. A lot of inventions, a lot of factories being built. And during this time period in the 18th and 19th century, there was a rapid change in the world about economy, like how money was made, how fortunes were made. And this prompted a lot of writers and musicians and playwriters to express the ideas of progress, how far and how fast the world was changing in their time period with inventions and factories being built, and then money and who had it and who didn't, and how that separated people into a wealthy class of people because they had a lot of money and a lower class of people. If you were living in this time period and your family was struggling to survive because they were poor and working in factories, you're going to write about people who are poor living and working in factories. And that's a recurring theme you'd see from a lot of different authors and playwrights and musicians. So the recurring themes here might be progress, growth in society, growth in factories, growth in inventions has a steep cost because it starts separating who's wealthy and who's not. And that harsh conditions. And when you worked in a factory in the Industrial Revolution, it was dangerous and it was hard, long hours of work. And that can kill the soul. It can kind of kill you in the sense that you're giving up hope, that nothing's going to change. You're just going to continue to live this life of poverty. Another one, World War One. A lot of young people went off to war in World War One because they felt a duty, they felt an obligation or responsibility to go fight for their country and go make sure that their way of life stayed the way it was. So if you lived through World War One, or somebody lived through World War Two, or Vietnam War, or the Persian Gulf War in the 90s, if you lived through this, you're going to write about what you know. That is a recurring theme in literature, in music, in movies. So living in the time of World War One, where there was a lot of sacrifice of the life you knew and were comfortable with to get uncomfortable and go to war, you could say a recurring theme was the glory of war is an illusion. It's fake. Oh, it looks great that you're, the publicity and you go be a hero and you save your country, but a lot of people who went to war didn't come home at all, or maybe some people came home from war and they were injured, severely injured, lost a limb. So the glory of war, the pictures of being this great hero riding into battle, was not always the case. It was fake. It was an illusion for some people. Or after such a tragedy, after you have a war, World War One, World War Two, the Vietnam War, 9/11 from 2001, after tragedies like this, the world is never the same. A lot of people are reading, I see, historical fiction novels, for example, and after the Berlin Wall, after the time of Hitler, the world was never the same. After the planes crashed into the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001, the world was never the same. And this is a theme that happened in movies and in books and in music that shows that this is the case. So, to review theme, which of the following statements would you say could be a universal theme? There's a fine line between love and hate. Lions are meat eaters. Cheryl was disappointed. We had fun hanging out with our friends. Which of these four would you say is a universal theme that could appear in many different stories from many different time periods and many different types of genres? There is a fine line between love and hate. That's a story and a theme that you can see in short stories, in novels, in plays, in movies, in music. That is a message that could be found a lot of different places. So we got two texts here, two examples. A girl once dressed as a boy and joined the army to save her elderly, sick father from being drafted or selected to go to war. She did all she could to avoid being discovered as a girl, and she proved to be a brave soldier. Our second text, the old man looked to the right and to the left. All was clear. Quick, in here, he urged the runaway slaves. You're safe with me. Don't make a sound or the neighbors will become suspicious. Now, let's get you some food. Two very different texts here. One about a girl going to war for her father, the other helping to get slaves, former slaves, to freedom, most likely from the South of the United States when slavery was uh, in use, to the North where they could be free. Two different stories, but do they share a theme? Is there a sentence below that I'm going to show you that shows or shares that a universal theme that is expressed in both stories. Liars hurt no one but themselves. Helping runaway slaves was illegal. Daughters should protect their fathers. Heroes often must take risks. What is a message you could take from both of those stories, even though their stories are very different? The idea that heroes must take risks often. The girl took a risk pretending to be a boy so he could go to war. The old man took a risk because he was saving slaves and getting them to freedom. So they're both heroes and they take risks, but two different, very different stories. Another two. We got the same passages there. Which of the details from these two stories best support that theme? Now we're looking for evidence that shows that the theme, heroes often take risks, is present in both stories. So could it be where it says a girl once dressed as a boy, and the second passage, the old man looked to the left and right? Is it join the army to save her father, or the old man saying you're safe with me? Is it part of the passage that says to avoid being discovered, and then passage 2, let's get you some food? Or she proved to be a brave soldier, and from the second one, all was clear? Well, the heroes must often take risks. That's the lesson we're trying to be shown. Well, if the girl joined the army to save her father, and the old man makes a statement of "you are safe with me," that is showing that they are doing heroic actions, but they're doing something that is also very risky. So those details help support the theme that heroes must often take risks. Here's another two examples where we look at two different texts and see if we can find a universal theme that goes along with them. Passage 1, I wanted to be grown up. When I'm grown up, I said, I'll do whatever I want. So then I grew up, but I had no idea being a grown up would be so hard. Passage 2, a king wished for the power to turn anything he touched into gold. At last, his wish was granted. Wanting to celebrate, he ran to his wife. My queen, he said, hugging her, I have such news. But she was dead, turned to gold. Let's look at a few statements. Which one says that there's a universal theme that both of these stories share? One, nonfiction, one, a fiction piece. What message do they both share? Is it don't trust your friends? Good deeds are rewarded? Appearances can be deceiving? Or be careful what you wish for? Despite these two stories having very different topics to them, very different events to them, they both share the idea, the theme, the message to be careful what you wish for. Bringing these back, if that is really our theme, be careful what you wish for, let's try and find some evidence to back those up. So the first one has two pieces of evidence, one from each story. The statement, I want to be grown up. The second one that begins with, a king wished for the power to turn anything he touched into gold. Is that the evidence that backs up that theme? Is it, when I'm grown up, I said, in the passage 1, and my queen, he said, in passage 2? Is it, but I had no idea being grown up would be so hard? Or in passage 2, but she was dead, turned to gold? Or is it, I'll do whatever I want? Or in passage 2, he ran to his wife. My queen, he said, hugging her, I have such news. Which of those two sets of evidence support the theme, be careful what you wish for. The statement, but I had no idea being grown up would be so hard. Hey, be careful what you wish for. You want to be grown up? Oh, I can't wait till I'm grown up. Oh, being a grown up is challenging. And in the second story, he always wanted everything he touched be turned to gold. He didn't realize touching his wife would turn her to gold, so be careful what you wish for. As we look more at theme moving forward, as we read Two Legs Are One, we look back at the stories we've already read, or soon moving forward, we're going to be looking for theme, that message we're supposed to get from the things we've read.